A little bit about body condition score. You've heard Dr. Wickersham talk a little bit about some basic beef cattle nutrition, specifically focusing on the cow. So now let's step back and we'll talk a little bit about the management side of the nutrition on the cows and supplementation of your cow-calf operation. And it doesn't matter if it's purebred or commercial, whether they're purebred or crossbred, it's always important when we're talking about supplementing cattle with a goal in mind. And it's the overall goal, whether it's we're developing heifers or bulls, or we're taking our cows and we're trying to make them through the winter so that they will rebreed. It's all about fertility. And so when we're thinking about supplementation, we've got to think about what our goals are and our targets. And so with that, let's take a little of the knowledge. We talked about body condition score, a little bit from Dr. Wickersham, and even some of the grazing management things we've talked about. And let's think about supplementation of the cow-calf producers. And so we know that cattle require protein and energy, as has been discussed. They've got a need for vitamins and minerals as well. And so they have these basic requirements from a nutrition, from a feed standpoint. Also, they require water and a high quality, good sources of water. Whenever we get into some water quality issues, whether it be maybe some excessive minerals or salts or those types of things, we can get maybe some nutrient imbalances. But for most producers, they really don't run into those problems. It's whenever we get into some areas where we do see some higher mineralization of that water, their water source. So when we think about supplementation, and I throw this slide up here because I try to work with ranchers and get them to have an understanding, because sometimes they'll get hung up and they say, well, you know, my mineral program is so important, it's the biggest thing. Or they'll call me and they'll say, okay, I've got my cows, I just didn't get the rebreeding rate that I had. I think I have a mineral problem. And then you begin to question them a little bit more, and it's maybe you see some pictures of their cows or go out and you see their cows and you say, well, I don't know if you got a mineral problem. I think maybe you have just an overall, you're not giving them enough nutrients in general. And so they're deficient in protein and energy because the cows are subsequently thin. And so mineral is extremely important. And I've got this picture here of energy and protein and in our macro minerals and our trace minerals. It all works together, and it's a balanced type approach there. And so it's important to think about all those and then think about the amounts. So minerals, you can see, they're kind of a building block, and they are very important, but they're in a small amount. And it doesn't matter if you have the greatest mineral supplementation program in the world, if you're not providing enough protein and energy, those cows are not going to breed back and cycle and be productive for you. And so those are some important things there. Again, when a cow, and we've already discussed this in class, the nutrient requirements, we've got nutrient requirements for maintenance, and we've got them for pregnancy, we've got them for gain, and we've got them for lactation, across all of those nutrients that an animal needs. Now, maintenance, it can change over time. As we get into some cold winters, where we have some wet conditions or maybe muddy conditions here in the southeast, maintenance requirements are going to go up because those cattle are burning it more. If they've got more area to cover over time, they're going to be burning up additional nutrients. And so maintenance will go up. Pregnancy changes as we go in the first and second portion of the gestation, or the first and second trimester. Not a huge drain, but when we move into that third trimester, we see our nutrient requirements really jump up. Lactation the same way. It's kind of a building block. We start off when that cow freshens up and begins to milk, it peaks at about 2 months and then it drops off like that as well. And so some factors that affect the nutrient requirements of the cattle are weight of the cow, and we'll show you some slides on the differences in cow size and how that changes their requirements. There are some subtle breed differences as well. Whether or not they're early in gestation, mid-gestation, late, or if they're in lactation, it changes as well. The weather and just activity will affect it as well. Genetics, we know that within breed types, there are some genetics that are a little more efficient than others as well. So lots of different factors that will affect the nutrient requirement of cattle. So if we look at some breed effects, we know some of the lowest maintenance energy requirements will be in our Brahman influenced cattle. And then we get into kind of the mid-range would be our British breed types like our Angus and Hereford. And then on the upper, as we increase it somewhat, we get into our higher energy requirements, and that would be our Limousin, Charolais, Chianina, and Simmental. So in general, our American breeds are a little lower, our British are mid, and our exotics or continental are on the upper end. Again, small differences between those three breed types, but there are some little subtle differences there. We talk about this particular slide and we look at the energy requirements and we look at kind of the production cycle of a cow. And as you can see, the green shows that that's our maintenance requirements. The yellow is going to be the requirements for pregnancy. And then the red is milk. So on the bottom there, you could see months post-calving. So as she calves, we could see that the requirements for pregnancy will drop off. Milk requirements will increase, and it bumps up. And then you could see at 2 months post-calving, that's when we have our highest energy requirements and protein requirements on that cow, and we call that our peak of lactation. And then those requirements begin to drop off as that milk production of that cow begins to taper off over time. And then you can see when we get out to that 6, 7 months, 8 months, whenever we wean that calf, that's going to be some of her lowest energy requirements there and protein requirements, or just overall lowest nutrient requirements. One thing to remember is that peak lactation is about 60 days after she calves. At about that 80 to 90 days is when we're trying to get her to breed back so that she will have her next calf about a year after that current calf was born. And so that's an important time when we're thinking about the nutrient requirements of that cow. Just wanted to show you some differences. Another slide looking at specifically the protein. And you can see as we go from a dry cow, we just weaned the calf off, about 1.5 pounds of protein required on a 1,200 pound cow for maintenance, all the way up to nearly 3 pounds at peak lactation. So some big differences. Same thing there if we look at on the energy, the TDN, we go from 10.9 all the way up to a 16.7 pounds of energy per day. So a 53% difference between those two. So there are some big differences in there. One of the things that I always visit with students and ranchers about is looking at those differences and trying to understand why maybe a calving season is important. Because if you're managing cattle that are out of that range, and maybe you've got some that are dry and some that are wet, you're going to be overfeeding or underfeeding those cattle. So another little side bit there. If you look at the nutrient requirements of cattle, a 2-year-old lactating female had her first calf. Her and a 3-year-old are going to have some of the highest nutrient requirements in the cow-calf operation. The reason for that is because they're still growing and they've had a calf, and so now they're lactating as well. Then we get into a virgin heifer or maybe a bull, developing bull, and then we get a mature cow with a higher milk and more of a moderate milk production. And then some of the lowest would be a dry cow late pregnancy, and would be at that stage, and a dry cow mid-pregnancy. And so as you can see, as we get further away from lactation, those cattle are going to have a little bit lower nutrient requirements. And as we talked about in the body condition score, as we pulled that calf off of that cow, we're just about getting into that last trimester. Her requirements are going up, but we still not near as high as they were whenever that cow just calved and we kind of approached that peak of lactation there. So again, we've already seen this slide on the priorities of the lactating cow and how important it is to realize that the last priority is always that reproduction there when we're talking about it. We've talked about body condition score, and that's going to be a very important visual indicator of those cows. Because the reality is, we can see, we've got in our background today, we've got some grass out there. We can go out and we can do some clippings and we can do some forage testing on that grass and get a better estimate of what those cattle are eating. But here we are, and we're in Texas now, and we're in this more southern central portion of Texas. It's February. The grass is changing right now. We're getting into some more of our spring grasses, late winter grasses. We're getting a lot of higher protein and energy in these forage conditions, and they're changing. And so even though we could go out and do some clippings, forage conditions will change over time. And so body condition gives us some indication of what those cattle are, how they're doing with what is out there. Again, if we're feeding hay, it's a little bit different story. If we're feeding hay to these cows, we have an idea of what they're getting in the forage that they're consuming. And so testing your hay is extremely important, because with testing, I have a better idea instead of just a guess of what that portion of their diet is going to be. And sometimes you'll see with some slides that we'll show you here in a little bit that forage quality on hay can be very good, or it can be extremely low. Some hay that doesn't appear to be very high in nutrient value may be very good. Some pretty hay may have some maturity on it, and it may be low in its nutritive value. So again, the forage testing, as you can see in this slide here, what they're doing, it gives you a really good indication of what those cows are eating. Then you begin to tailor your supplementation program based off of that, of the nutrients that are in that hay.